We've all heard the grim truth about white masters raping enslaved black women, but what about the mistresses, the respectable plantation wives who force themselves on enslaved black men? In this episode, we're pulling back the curtain on the bizarre, shocking, and hidden intimate lives of white mistresses on the plantation. Life for these women was a twisted mix of privilege and bitterness. In the social hierarchy of the plantation, they were second only to their husbands. And with that power came control over the lives of the enslaved. They ordered the work, dealt out punishments, and sometimes took sadistic pleasure in using their authority to humiliate others. A female slave could be flogged for the smallest offense, a dropped plate, a look that was taken as disrespect. Others were punished by being forced to stand in the blistering southern sun for hours, skin burning, body weakening, with no water, no mercy. Every part of plantation life was designed to strip away humanity, to crush the spirit. The former slave Harriet Jacobs, in her searing memoir Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, described growing up in a world drenched in sexual danger and fear, a place where slave girls were stalked by the desires of white men and watched with suspicion and jealousy by white women. These mistresses were trapped in their own way, married off at 15 or 16, expected to be dutiful, smiling, obedient wives, but their cages were lined with gold. They might have been bound by social rules, but they were still powerful over the enslaved, and many of them knew exactly how to use that power. Their husbands' constant affairs with enslaved women produced children who were enslaved themselves, some of whom would one day be under the authority of the very mistresses who hated the sight of them. The humiliation festered into cruelty, and when the masters were away, sometimes for weeks or months, the loneliness and resentment turned into something darker. Some mistresses sought revenge, not on their husbands, but on the enslaved men and boys who had no power to refuse them. While far less common than the predatory acts of white masters, these relationships did happen, and when they did, they were almost always acts of coercion, a power play in which refusal wasn't an option. Captain Richard Hinton recorded cases of mistresses forcing enslaved men into sexual submission, and Harriet Jacobs hinted at the same in her testimony. These women understood the position they held, that they had over the enslaved the same total control their own fathers once had over them. That made it frighteningly easy for them to single out the most vulnerable, the most powerless, the most brutalized, and take what they wanted. In the public eye, they were the symbols of Christian virtue, the glue that held the household together, guardians of morality. But behind closed doors, some shattered every value they pretended to uphold. The plantation was a place where every human relationship, even the most intimate, was poisoned by the rot of slavery. And the white mistress, so often painted as a victim in popular memory, was sometimes one of its most calculating predators. Adultery in the 1800s was dangerous, especially for women. A wife caught in an affair could be ruined, shunned, or even punished by law. And yet, white women in the South were celebrated as perfect examples of morality and purity, the angels of the home. At least, that's the image society wanted to believe. Step onto a southern plantation, however, and that image shatters instantly. The truth was uglier, dirtier, and far more disturbing than polite history admits. To truly understand the filth at the core of slavery, you'd have to put yourself in the skin of an enslaved black person. Only then would you see past the lies, and into a world where the souls of the so-called civilized seemed to have rotted away. White women of high social rank preached about chastity, claiming they were morally superior to black women. But in secret, some of these same women pursued sexual relationships with enslaved black men. They justified it by clinging to ideas of their own superiority and by venting their personal frustrations on people they could control. Sometimes these encounters led to pregnancies. When that happened, everything had to be hidden to avoid scandal. The biracial children born of these affairs became more than just shameful reminders. For some mistresses, they became tools. In a twisted way, having these children gave the mistress a sense of power she couldn't get from her own marriage. It was a dangerous game, one that constantly risked public disgrace. But it was also a stark reminder that life on a plantation was a tangled knot of power, abuse, and deep prejudice. Plantation wives were supposed to be pure, loving, and loyal to their husbands. In reality, many were deeply bitter. Just like the slaves, they were technically the property of their husbands, men who could exploit them sexually just as they did the enslaved women. Their freedom was tightly controlled. They rarely traveled without a male escort, and under Southern slave codes, their authority over enslaved people was written directly into law. The Low Country slave codes, like those in South Carolina, spelled it out. Slaves who fled their master or mistress could be castrated. If they tried to escape again, they could be mutilated further. Another law from 1740 even warned that if a master or mistress failed to provide food, clothing, or shelter for the enslaved, they could be held legally responsible. In Georgia, the law threatened fines for any master, mistress, or overseer who allowed a slave to work without official permission. Slave laws used gender-neutral language on purpose, because women were just as capable of being masters as men, and they were. Because colonial life was dangerous and unstable, many male heads of households died young, leaving widows in charge. Some of these women gained huge economic power through slave ownership. They didn't just inherit slaves. They bought, sold, rented out, and even willed them to others. This gave them financial influence and social standing that few women had, but they knew the system was stacked against them. The Southern patriarchy hated the idea of women having independence. So to protect their position, these women fiercely upheld the very racist system that gave them power in the first place. Single women with slaves clung to their authority. Wealthy brides often came into marriage with slaves gifted by their parents. And although, in law, a wife's property belonged to her husband, the reality was more complicated. Some mistresses fiercely guarded control over their slaves. Former slave Silas Glenn recalled how his mistress treated the slaves she inherited from her father better than the ones from her husband's side, and how she wouldn't let her husband manage or sell them. For women who had grown up owning slaves, the idea of themselves as masters was part of their identity. They knew the business. Some became skilled traders. Mrs. Annie Poor, for example, sold slaves for high prices after training them in valuable trades like cooking and carpentry. She studied market prices, exploited changes in demand, and even attended slave auctions herself, or sent trusted agents to bid for her. These women were not just figureheads. They were active, ruthless participants in the slave economy. Some gained wealth, independence, and social influence in a world designed to keep women powerless, and they did it by crushing the lives of the people they owned. On the plantation, power came at a cost, and for the enslaved, that cost was everything. Most people assume that if white mistresses saw the sexual abuse of enslaved women, they might have felt pity. The reality, often it was the opposite. Trapped under the suffocating rules of female purity and unable to stop their husband's abuse, many mistresses turned a blind eye, or worse, took out their anger on the very victims who suffered most. Mistress Mary Boykin Chestnut, for example, could call slavery a wrong and an inequity because of the sexual chaos it caused. Yet in the same breath, she labeled enslaved women as prostitutes. She managed to paint herself as the only true victim, while showing almost no sympathy for the women actually being assaulted. Many mistresses clung to racist lies about black women being animalistic, hypersexual, and somehow complicit in their own abuse. Boykin Chestnut even claimed to feel faint watching a mixed-race woman sold for sexual purposes, but then described the woman as grinning seductively at bidders, as if she welcomed it. On smaller plantations, where mistresses couldn't escape seeing their husbands' affairs, the cruelty became personal. Their jealousy and humiliation often exploded into violence. Solomon Northup, in his autobiography, wrote of Patsy, a young enslaved woman who was whipped mercilessly at her mistress's command. The mistress urged her husband or other slaves to flog Patsy out of spite, and once even tried to bribe Northup to kill her. This wasn't emotional outburst. It was terror, unpredictable and constant, a different kind of torture that left deep scars on the mind as well as the body. Mistresses also found ways to exploit enslaved women's motherhood. Scholars Emily West and Rosie J. Knight have shown how mistresses used the market for wet nurses to their advantage, turning enslaved women's bodies into tools for their own convenience. Sometimes it was because they were sick. Sometimes it was pure vanity, the belief that breastfeeding would make their own breasts sag and lose beauty. Harriet Jacobs remembered her own mother being forced to stop nursing her at just 3 months old so the mistress's baby could get enough milk. For the mistress, it was a simple choice. For the enslaved mother, it meant giving up feeding her own child so another woman's baby could thrive. It was a gendered cruelty, one that mixed motherhood with exploitation. Mistresses interfered in enslaved women's pregnancies and births too, choosing midwives, deciding where births would happen, even administering remedies. On the surface, this might look like care, but in reality, a healthy slave child was an investment, another body to work or sell. Motherhood was not a shared bond across racial lines. It was a business decision. And it wasn't just women who were targeted. Some white mistresses also took sexual advantage of enslaved men. Historian Thomas Balcerski notes that while rare, these relationships revealed just how clearly mistresses understood the plantation's hierarchy. and how easily they could twist it to their benefit. Harriet Jacobs described one such case, a mistress who chose an enslaved man precisely because he was utterly powerless. His inability to refuse was the very reason she picked him. It was domination disguised as choice, an intimate violation made possible by the racial and social order. Even daily life carried a quiet, disturbing undercurrent. Enslaved men often worked shirtless in the southern heat, their bodies constantly visible to the plantation's elite women. Sometimes it stirred curiosity, other times it was simply accepted as normal, but for certain mistresses, the sight became part of the power play. They demanded massages, personal services, and sometimes even used threats to keep their desires secret, warning enslaved men that if they told, she could accuse them of rape and have them destroyed. On the plantation, intimacy was never free. It was a weapon, and in the hands of a mistress, it could be just as sharp, just as destructive as any whip. Just as white men used racist lies to excuse their abuse, white mistresses also learned how to twist those same stereotypes for their own ends. They took the long-standing, poisonous link society had made between blackness and sexual danger and turned it into a weapon. These women, often seen as powerless in a man's world, found their own disturbing form of power by exploiting the most vulnerable bodies around them. History is full of these overlooked stories. Stories that break apart the myths we've been fed and expose the raw, unsettling truths beneath. And there are many more waiting in the shadows, ready to be uncovered.